Hi, everyone, and welcome to my new show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This is the first episode, so I want to explain what I hope to accomplish by having this show. I look at 9/11 as a crime and not an act of war. As with every crime, there are suspects for that crime. I believe that, along with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, elements within our government and other governments have more than earned the title of suspect for the crime of 9/11. That being said, I don't know what happened that day or who was ultimately responsible. Admitting this, in my opinion, has made me a better advocate for 9/11 justice. Here's what I do know. I do know that we were lied to about a great many things about that day. I do know that there are many examples of individuals attempting to cover up this or that. I do know that there are many examples of people outright lying about the attacks. I do know that people who should have been held accountable were instead rewarded and promoted. I do know that many polls over the years show that a majority of people question what we were told about that day. I do know that the corporate media has only attacked those who question what we were told about that day. I do know that each investigation we had its own version of corruption and compromise, especially the 9/11 Commission. I do know that the families who lost someone that day and the people of the world both deserve and require real truth, accountability, and justice for what happened that day. The last thing I know is that because of all of the lies of 9/11, there is no justification for all of the evil that we have committed in the name of that day and in the names of those lost that day. I don't want to focus on theories about what happened that day. I want to focus on the fact that we were lied to about 9/11. It's a simple and true statement, and I'm hoping that it reaches a majority of people. I want to educate people about everything I just said. Learning about 9/11 is a very hard and daunting task. I want to help people with it, and that is why I am having this show. I want to thank Cindy Sheehan for asking me to do this. She is my hero and my friend.
Okay, this is John, and I'm here with Jenna Orkin, and I'm going to quickly read her bio for us. Jenna Orkin is the author of The Moron's Guide to Global Collapse. After 9/11, she was among the first to question the EPA's announcement that the air was safe to breathe. She went on to co-found the World Trade Center Environmental Organization, as well as other Lower Manhattan activist organizations that revealed and testified to the EPA's lies. Later, she wrote for FromTheWilderness.com, the website founded by 9/11 investigative journalist Mike Rupert, who sadly killed himself in April of this year. Hi, Jenna, my very first guest ever. Welcome to We Were Lied to About 9/11. How are you feeling?
Wonderful. And you?
Oh, I'm doing okay. Now, before we get started, I wrote my own little personal bio for you, and I wanted to read that.
Okay.
All right. So the date was September 9th, 2004. The venue, the 9/11 omission hearings that were held in New York City and chaired by then former Representative Cynthia McKinney. I had never heard about the environmental impact of 9/11 before. Our corporate media wasn't telling us about it, apparently. Anyway, Jenna spoke and quite literally changed my life. If there was a barrier that I had trouble hurdling over with regards to the notion that elements within our government are more than willing to kill Americans, Jenna destroyed that barrier. Also, because of her, I started paying extra close attention to the 9/11 first responders and their fate. If not for Jenna, I would never have done the work that I've done with regards to the 9/11 first responders. Now, before we get started, I just want to point out that the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act was eventually passed after a long and hard-fought battle over it, and the responders are getting a lot of help that they would have never have gotten before. The Zadroga Act is not permanent, however, and eventually the responders will have to go to D.C. to fight to renew it. I just wanted to get that out of the way before we start our discussion. So hi again, Jenna.
Yeah, hi.
All right, my very first question is, living in the Manhattan area, what was the day of 9/11 like for you?
Okay, you just raised something that I feel it imperative to answer, which is that the Zadroga Act money will, wane, and they'll have to go back and fight for more. It will be much harder because you will have a mushrooming series of cancers appearing, from, let's say, around 20 years after 9/11. So I believe that they passed the Zadroga Act with a ceiling on the amount of money because they knew that this was coming up. Anybody with any experience with incubation periods and, medical subjects like that would know that. So, when they assigned a certain amount of money, it was with that in mind. Anyway, so the day of 9/11,
Yep.
I was going to the gym, and a neighbor said, "Did you see that a plane crashed into the World Trade Center? They think it's terrorists." So I looked out the window. I was living in Brooklyn, and you could see the smoke. And so I went, change of plans, went back to the apartment, called my son's school because he was going to high school at Stuyvesant, 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The line was busy. I made subsequent calls. The line was always busy. Then I called my ex-husband who worked down in that neighborhood and, to see if he could get our son. And we spoke a bit, and then he said, "I got to go. I just saw somebody jump out the 90th floor." That was the first time I ever heard about that.
Jesus.
It was the first time it was happening. And so I tried to get to Stuyvesant. Everything was closed. You couldn't take the train. You couldn't walk across the bridge. You were, sequestered. And that was a fait accompli. So I went back to the apartment, made all kinds of calls. Other people were calling me. My cousin said, she'd heard on the radio that Stuyvesant had been evacuated. That turned out to be a false alarm. What happened at the school, my son was in physics class, and they saw the first plane hit the building, and they looked out the window. The physics teacher then goes and closes the blinds, which becomes kind of emblematic of the attitude of so many people, including at the school, about what was happening. The head of the school, the FBI showed up at the school, and the head of the school, the principal, Stanley Titel, said, "Should we evacuate?" And the FBI said, "No." And the head of the school, and then, how did this go? He said, "What's the chance that the buildings are going to come down?" And the FBI guy said, "Not a chance." Then when the first building fell, the FBI guy said, "Now you got to evacuate everybody because the vibrations could bring down this building." So at that point, they evacuated the kids. There was a teacher downstairs and there are 3,200 kids in the school. A teacher downstairs said, "You see that person on your, to your left or your right? I don't care if you know them or not. That's your buddy. Stay with them. Run. Go uptown." So my son was carrying his backpack because he'd never gotten his act together to get a locker, 26-pound backpack. I weighed it when he finally got home. And he walked 5 miles, and he went to the house of I guess she was a schoolmate. I don't even think he knew her. And several other people went there, too, and I don't know, And a friend of mine picked him up and took him to lunch, and that restaurant was filled with refugees from Lower Manhattan. And they were passing people on the street. One woman was crying, and my son said to my friend, "Do you know why she was crying?" And my friend said, "No." And my son said, "Her train was late. If it had been on time, she would have been in the building." And then my friend told me he just fell asleep at the lunch table. It was, it'd been so exhausting. So, the day was very hectic.
Obviously. Horrible.
Yeah, right.
So that...
what's your next? Yeah.
Well, it's just horrible. I mean, I can't imagine what it was like to be there that day. I mean, I'm from Philadelphia, so the only coverage that I saw was the constant showing of the buildings collapsing by, the corporate media.
Right.
All right. Go ahead.
Also say, there were parents who lived in Manhattan and were able to get to the school, but they weren't allowed in because the administration didn't know them. And they were afraid at that time. They didn't know if there were terrorists out in the street. So they just locked the doors to people.
Right.
That's another little detail.
All right. My next question. Why did you start to question what New Yorkers were being told about the air and water quality?
Because the following day, that same friend who had picked up my son had a lunch engagement, not exactly in that neighborhood, of course, sufficiently north where, life was still going on as per normal, whatever normal is after 9/11. And she said it smelled god-awful. It's the air that's going to be the problem. Well, that turned out to be prophetic. And so immediately I was concerned about that. There was an enormous rush to get the kids back into the building because it's a population that's terribly ambitious. It's a very competitive school. And they have to take an exam. A lot of, the kids go to the best colleges after that, and they love that school. State-of-the-art science labs and clubs. It was the only school my son ever loved. And so, to question what the government was saying was to fight the common, it's like fighting the church in the Middle Ages or something. I mean, everybody wanted to go back. There were a couple of naysayers. I quickly made friends with them, but we were too few. And on top of that, the school administration, the parent association was lied to about whether the ventilation system had been cleaned. The school underwent $1 million cleanup, but it excluded the ventilation system, and they lied about that to the Parents Association. So everybody was rushing back to the school, and they didn't find out until after the fact. That's a very key factor.
It was essentially the safety of your son that prompted you to do the questioning.
That was the entirety of it. Apart from that, it didn't affect me at all.
Could you briefly tell us what kind of toxins were found in the dust? This is something that when I first heard you speak, it was just amazing to me. None of it occurred to me. So could you do that?
The Sierra Club report written in, I believe, 2003 or 4 said over 2,000 contaminants. Well, that's plenty, but in fact there are 80,000 manufactured in the United States, and so there are probably more, but who cares? Anyway, you had 50,000 computers just in World Trade Centers 1 and 2, each made with a couple of pounds of lead. Mercury, 41 milligrams of mercury per fluorescent light bulb. Calculate that for those 2 buildings. Those 2 buildings constituted a city with its own zip code. So everything that's in a city was in there. You had doctors' offices with radiation equipment. You had smoke alarms that had radioactive americium-241. And then about, early October, Dr. Thomas Cahill, who came in from UC Davis, tested and ultrafine particles. They were the highest he'd ever gotten out of 7,000 samples he'd taken around the world, including at the burning Kuwaiti oil fields. We beat them all. Just catastrophic levels of dioxin, and you can go on and on.
And the alkalinity of the...
Oh, the alkalinity, thank you. Yes, they lied. Right, equivalent to drain cleaner. And what the EPA did about that was so ingenious because they reduced it by, from 11 to 10, somewhere around there. And to the layman, it looks like not much of a reduction. It looks like a 10%, 9% reduction. In fact, it's a logarithmic scale, so you're reducing it by a factor of 10, and they don't tell you that, of course.
Right. No, geez. Now, Christy Todd Whitman, the former head of the EPA, is the one that made many statements saying that everything was okay. On September 24th, 2006, the New York Post reported that, quote, Condoleezza Rice's office gave final approval to the infamous Environmental Protection Agency press releases days after 9/11, claiming the air around Ground Zero was, quote, safe to breathe, internal documents show, end quote. New York One is the only other news outlet to report on that story. Nothing ever came of it. The story went away. To your knowledge, is this story true?
Well, I don't have any personal knowledge. I only know what I read, which is, the same thing that you read. But I would say, this dovetails with the question of who ultimately is responsible. And Condoleezza Rice, if her office said the air safe to breathe, they're getting their information from the EPA. They're not in the business of environmental protection. It's not their area of expertise, so they're just mouthing what they're told. So really the EPA has to be held ultimately responsible. They're the ones in charge. And I would also really love to question, and nobody ever will, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which is the dark horse in this whole story.
You all right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Okay, but it was the White House that essentially got the EPA to rewrite the reports to be more...
It was the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And James Connaughton is a very interesting figure because lots of things lead back to James Connaughton, like, comments about climate change, denying it or downplaying it, can be traced back to him. Changing the press releases where cautionary statements on asbestos become reassurances, eventually lead back to Connaughton's office. He was called into question by the Senate, and I have up on my computer what Chairman James Inhofe concluded about that. That was in 2003. This is Inhofe's investigation. EPA acted properly in its response, as well as in its communications with the public. The administration did not suppress any, you can imagine what it says,
right.
That kind of thing. Then later, Hillary Clinton questioned Connaughton, but, he tap danced out of that. Nothing ever happens to any of these people. It all rolls right off them.
Well, the only form of accountability that I'm aware of with regards to Christy Todd Whitman is that there was a judge that one time said something about her actions in a very negative way. I don't remember exactly.
Okay. That was Judge, I think her name is Deborah Batts. I may be confused. Yeah, I think that was it. Okay, that was a lawsuit of residents, students, and office workers against the EPA. And I was named in one of the original plaintiffs because I'd had my carpet tested for asbestos, and the results showed, it was not conclusive, but too much asbestos according to ultrasonication, which was an EPA-approved test, but a test which they did not apply after 9/11 down at the World Trade Center. They questioned their own test. Anyway, so we sued the EPA. And at the lower court level, this wonderful judge gave an incredibly strong statement that Christy Todd Whitman's action shocked the conscience. It was fantastic. Hillary Clinton held a press conference, and it was all triumphant. Of course, what does the EPA do? They appeal, and next thing you know, that's the end of that. And the higher court judge said, basically, it seemed to me that if you read between the lines, he was saying, if you don't allow the government to lie, they won't talk at all. So we have to let them lie. I mean, that's what, in legalese, what it sounded like.
Well, and then another form of accountability that Christy Todd Whitman faced was testifying before Jerry Nadler, and he literally tore her apart. And that's on video, and that's a form of accountability, I guess, but they're not.
Right,
they're
and
not
then she was going to run for president, and she didn't. Okay, but this is a Hydra's head. You cut one off, and you get 5 other monsters.
Right.
So.
All right. So, how does Hugh Kaufman fit into this story?
Hugh Kaufman was the chief investigator for the EPA ombudsman in, I believe, the Solid Waste Department. And so, starting in February of 2002, we met with him and Robert Martin, the ombudsman, at the office of Joel Kupferman, who is a wonderful lawyer and one of the heroes of 9/11. And Kaufman and Martin held hearings which were the best ever on this disaster, because at the other hearings, the government kowtowed to the agencies, and the agencies would say, if you don't let us go on first, we're not going to appear at all. And so they'd let them go on first, and knowing full well, everybody knew full well, the press had a deadline, and they'd be gone by the time, the ragtag militia of activists and independent scientists spoke, telling the truth. So that's the way it had been working until the ombudsman's hearing, when he put the best witnesses up first. So at least it's in the record. And he was Hugh Kaufman was a tremendous hero after the BP disaster. He was all over the place warning of what...
Right, I do remember that. But he wasn't... He was not officially working for the EPA. He was somebody who used to work for the EPA.
He was.
I'm sorry?
He was. He was the chief investigator for the EPA ombudsman. Which
right.
is like, the watchdog within the EPA, making sure they did what they were supposed to do.
Right. Now, both local and federal governments were aware that the air was not safe to breathe when they made their statements, correct?
Well, it depends, a lot of people. I think some people knew more than others. And what they normally do is hand over the statement to some poor little innocent who genuinely doesn't know that it's a false statement. And so it's like money laundering. By the time you put somebody in front of the camera, they have no direct access to the original data, and they believe what they're told. They believe what they're saying, and it makes it more effective.
Right, exactly. But the White House was certainly aware of the harm when they changed the EPA statements and so forth.
Oh, God, yes.
All right. Can you tell me about why some 9/11 first responders were told not to wear respirators?
Some of them were told it just looked bad. You're going to frighten the public. It's, it's bad PR. You don't want to do that.
As a result, it's one of the factors as to why many 9/11 first responders are now sick and dying, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Now, can you... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Some residents wore respirators because some well-meaning person said you should really do that. The residents were advised to clean up their own apartments, and where the dust was really bad, just wear long pants and you'll be fine.
Right, I remember that. And to use wet cloths to clean the dust. Isn't that how it went?
Yes, that's how it went. And some of them would put on a respirator, but nobody told them to change the filter. So they used the same one, so it was, useless.
Jeez. Can you explain how Wall Street fits into this story?
According to the report by the EPA Inspector General in August of 2003, part of the motivation of downplaying the air quality was to get Wall Street up and running, ASAP, which is what they did.
So money is more important than people.
Oh, for sure.
Right. That just boggles my mind. It gets me so angry. Now, is there anything else you want to say about that, or?
Well, I think another motivation for being so kind of counterintuitive and counterhumane and everything else was, and it's not just what I think, doesn't matter what I think, is that EPA wanted to set a new precedent for environmental disasters. They already had in place, since this is what they do for a living, they had a protocol to clean up after an environmental disaster. You test in concentric circles starting from the epicenter. You see in what direction the contaminants went. You do more cleaning up in that direction. It's scientifically valid that it had been done. And then they kept saying, well, but 9/11 was unprecedented. Of course it is. Everything's unprecedented. History does not repeat itself verbatim. But there are certain patterns that are followed. So they completely broke with tradition as far as 9/11 went. And they did not do that testing in concentric circles, etc. And they certainly didn't clean up according to their own protocols. So they, were setting a new standard, which is there's a disaster, it's unprecedented, and you're on your own.
Well, we saw the same things with Katrina. We saw the same things with the BP oil spill.
Right.
So go ahead.
So they knew that kind of disaster was in the offing, and they didn't want to set the precedent of being responsible to clean it up.
Right. Well, that they are, and they didn't. And, anyway, several thousand 9/11 first responders are sick, and well over 1,000 have died. Are you aware of the amount of New Yorkers that became ill, or are you aware of any that have died as a result of the toxic dust? And I'm aware of. I'm sorry. I'm aware of a nun who passed away and donated her body so it could be studied to better help people. But that's the only civilian death I'm aware of.
Right. There is. Okay. You're never going to get an adequate answer on that because people will die of it. And, toxins don't announce themselves in the blood. They don't have little labels on them. I'm just looking at one now. Somebody called Felicia Dunn-Jones in 2007 died of World Trade Center poisoning. Okay, so
I remember that name.
Huh?
I remember that name. Go ahead.
Right. So that was one that was officially linked. But officially linked is, an obstacle course to get over or through. And I'm sure there are more. No, but you'll never get the real number there.
Well, that's unfortunate. According to findlaw.com, second-degree murder is partially defined as, quote, a killing caused by dangerous conduct and the offender's obvious lack of concern for human life, end quote. Do you agree that this perfectly describes the actions of our government with regards to the environmental impact of 9/11?
Sure. That was easy.
That was very easy. It's unfortunate that we never were able to hold anyone accountable under that standard, but it does seem to perfectly describe it. Now, in your eyes, who should be held accountable for the lies regarding the toxic dust?
Up the chain of command at the EPA, and I would love to see the White House Council on Environmental Quality really investigated, but I'm not holding my breath.
And that's it. Okay. You told me that you are now working on the fracking issue. What would you like to tell us about that?
All right. Fracking is one disgusting example of the fallout, the consequences of an idea. It's not an idea, it's a fact. The fact of peak oil. Peak oil does not mean we're running out of oil. It means we have run out of easy oil. And that's obvious across the board. So when you run out of easy oil, it's not simply a matter of, okay, switching gears and we'll just get the more difficult oil. I mean, the BP disaster is a direct consequence of peak oil. They would not have been drilling in the ocean. They would not be going down thousands of meters into this treacherous and expensive terrain to extract oil if there was easier oil available. So, fracking and poisoning the water is one symptom. BP is another symptom. The fact that Saudi Arabia is saying, okay, we're interested in going solar, that's scary. That means that Saudi Arabia is past peak, although they'll never admit it.
Right.
Because they were the fountainhead for the world.
Yep.
So this situation where, there's just this desperate grab for the last remaining resources is playing out all over the world, and it's one of the reasons you're having the unrest in the Middle East over Gaza, because, the gas that Israel wants. And
right. Dr. Nafiz Ahmed wrote an article about that for The Guardian.
That's right. So you don't hear these words, peak oil. You don't. You hear that it's because of rockets and or crazy Arabs or something. The real bottom line here is that we have resource wars going on, and they can only get worse as long as we keep our economic system, which is based on infinite growth. Because if you need more and more and more money, you're going to need more and more people, and there's not enough, there are not enough resources for them.
Right. Can quickly explain what infinite growth means. To me, it means, that oil does not regrow itself. When you run out of... Go ahead.
Okay, it's really about economic infinite growth. What it means is that when you put $100 in the bank, you expect to get back a little more. And everybody gets more than they put in. And where does it come from? And really where it comes from these days is from the Federal Reserve printing it. And they have the authority to do that, which they got from the Bretton Woods Agreement at the end of World War II. There are certain major banks, the European Central Bank, that have this luxury. But pieces of paper with lots of zeros on them only work up to a point. You can't say to China, we owe you so many trillions of dollars, and then stick another few zeros on the piece of paper you give them. China is not fooled. So the dollar is losing its status in the world that we got from that Bretton Woods Agreement, and China and Russia are just leaving the dollar behind and turning towards the ruble, the yuan, and gold. This is going to leave us in a very desperate situation. And what the economy is based on is real stuff in the earth, real minerals, food. It doesn't matter if you have $1 trillion and there's no water. It all comes down to that.
You can't eat a dollar.
That's correct.
All right. Before we finish, are there any websites you would like to promote?
Well, let's see. I wasn't expecting that. Mike Gruber's website, if you for 9/11 information, fromthewilderness.com. For the World Trade Center environmental information, the first website I put up was WTCEO.org, World Trade Center Environmental Organization.org. And,
Well, I would like to personally promote the Feel Good Foundation, feelgoodfoundation.com or .org, I think. Do you have any more?
No, I'm going to regret this afterwards. I'm going to be kicking myself. But those, I think Public Wilderness is very important. Of course, Feel Good for the Ground Zero workers, yes.
Right. Well, Jenna, I very much appreciate you coming on my show. It's actually an honor to have you on my show. You're a hero of mine, and that's all I can say. I just thank you.
Well, thank you, John. It's great to talk to you.
Well, wonderful. All right, thank you for coming on, and we'll talk to you again someday.
Thank you, John.
All right, thanks, Jenna.
Right, bye.
Here's a little announcement I would like to make for a 9/11 family member. Be sure and check out Sarah Van Auken's play in New York City this 9/11 anniversary called This Is Not About 9/11. She's the daughter of famous Jersey girl Lori Van Auken. The show opens on this year's September 11th anniversary, which is a Thursday at 8 p.m. There will be 3 shows to follow the opening on the 12th at 8 p.m. and the 13th at 2 p.m. and 8 p.m. The play will take place in the middle of Times Square at the John Desautels Studio, which is on the 3rd floor of the Times Square Arts Center, located at 300 West 43rd Street. Tickets to the show are currently available on the Ticket Leap website. You can go on the Ticket Leap site and search for This Is Not About 9/11. You can also get tickets at the door, but seating is very limited, so they're encouraging people to get their tickets in advance to reserve a seat. I'd like to say good luck to Sarah, Ellie, and the rest of the crew for This Is Not About 9/11.